Most people are totally intimidated by the big, scary world of tax liens, tax sales, mortgage foreclosures. But Bryan Seiden-Sega has earned a fortune niching down into this space that so many other people are either confused by or intimidated by or just otherwise avoid. So by way of quick introduction, Bryan Seiden-Sega, he's the founder of Tax Sale Resources at Mount North Capital. Bryan, welcome to the show. And let's just start with a really high-level summary, or what's the difference between tax liens, tax sales, and then people know what mortgage foreclosures are, of course. But just give us like the really quick summary.
Bryan, thanks for having me. First off, I gotta say I'm obviously biased, but you have an amazing first name.
Yeah.
I think it's easier to explain, how tax sales work, right? And then that it makes what difference between tax lien and tax deed, I think, fairly obvious. So if somebody doesn't pay their taxes, right, the
property taxes,
most counties and every state's slightly different, but most states they want that money, right? And so before a property is sold, they will say, "Hey, investor, I really need my money to pay for firemen, pay teachers, pave the roads, etc. I will." Basically put a lien on that property, and that'll be your collateral if you give me the amount those taxes were due, right? And that's a tax lien. And so the investor in that scenario is buying a tax lien, right? They don't own the property. They have an interest in that property. Very similar to a mortgage, happens to be superior to mortgage, but very similar mentality of how a mortgage works. I like to use micro mortgages.
And let me just pause you there for 1 second. So a tax lien will supersede an existing mortgage lien. Is that correct?
In almost every state. There's a couple that don't, but devil's in the details, right, Bryan?
Yeah.
So if that property owner continues to not pay their taxes multiple years, in some cases 6+ years, then that lien holder, the person that bought the lien, does have the right to foreclose on that property, just like a mortgage holder, right? The difference is typically on a mortgage, it can be a month or 2 or maybe 6 months they can foreclose, and then on the tax sale side, it's multiple years. But the result is a foreclosure process that ends in the sale of that property to a third party. Now that is the sale of the tax deed, right? And so now you're buying the property, you're owning the property. And that's the difference between a tax deed, which is buying the property, and a tax lien, which is having interest in the property. And they're not the same.
All right. Got it. So you have sort of a niche approach to this, even beyond, what we just talked about. So walk us through your strategy here and how maybe other people who have been sitting on the sidelines with this strategy, maybe avoiding it, maybe didn't understand it fully, how they might follow suit.
Well, I think there's two ways to look at the industry. One is, do you want to be more passive? Then you're better to stick in the tax lien realm, because it's, you're not having to deal with, code violations, mowing the lawn, right? Tax deeds is no different than buying the real estate in any other fashion, right? Through a broker, through an auction. It is a much more active investment. And so if your goal is to not be active, then avoid the tax deed space. Versus, on liens, it's much more passive, and it could be years that you hold that lien where it's accruing interest. And it just doesn't take a whole lot of work other than making sure that you do what you need to maintain your position, right? Just like a mortgage holder, you have to make sure you notice correctly and do those things, but you're not having to be actively managing that asset and trying to figure out how to repair the roof and do all those things. That's not what's needed.
And with tax liens, my understanding is that in most states, you are legally entitled to a certain percentage of interest a year on that tax lien. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. And you know, like every state's slightly different. In some states, it's a minimum that you get. Some states it's based on what you bid. Some states you're bidding down and based on what you bid down. But you are earning a rate on that lien as long as you bid correctly and bought a correct lien.
Okay, gotcha. All right, sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
So on the deed side is obviously much more active. Now we provide services as far as data platform for both, but as far as the Mount North Capital end of what we do, we're much more active in the deed space because it is so I'll say inefficient, and that's really where we found our success, right, is a niche, like you said, a niche within a niche within a niche within a niche. And that seems to be where we found kind of enough inefficiencies to where we could figure out how to take advantage of those inefficiencies. And that's really what we've done, is figure out how to buy tax deeds and where can we buy them where you get the best deals.
So where can you buy them to get the best deals?
Well, I don't want to give away all of our secret sauce, but we've been monitoring what stuff sells for at auction, nationwide, and so we have a pretty good idea of where you get better deals, where you don't get good deals. And the exact answer I found is that's different for everybody. I can tell you, like, you can get the best deal on a property in the middle of Arkansas. That doesn't necessarily equate to where you want to own real estate, right? And so there's a happy medium between the two, and that happy medium, where we find a lot of success is in states like Texas, where still live auctions, right? If you can imagine, what the COVID did is make a lot of auctions that were always live, they had to go online. And so the auctions that stayed live, you have a whole lot less competition today than you did before. And so that's one of the things that we do, is target live auctions, because the competition is typically less. But you have to have the things in place in order to attend those auctions. But in general, that can be a really great rule to follow.
And before we hit the record button, we started having a pretty interesting conversation about how mortgage foreclosures, there's actually a niche within a niche there as well at some of these live auctions. So I wanted to pass that on to our listeners as well, and what you're seeing in that space, because a lot of people think that they know everything there is to know about mortgage foreclosures, and maybe they don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, but you actually were raising some interesting points about what you're seeing in that space. So let's hear it.
Yeah, I think in general, mortgage foreclosures, the golden age, if you were an investor in that space, was 10, 11, 12, when you could attend any mortgage foreclosure, and there's just so much volume that you're going to find deals, right? As long as you're okay sitting on that asset for a period of time. Now the latest trend, or that I constantly hear still, right, is like there's so much saturation in investors in that space. You can't find deals at mortgage foreclosures. And I think in general, they're probably right. But we were sitting at auctions, keep in mind, we were only there for the tax sale auctions. And we started going to these auctions down in Texas in some areas. And it was literally one giant room. And on half of the room, the tax sales that we're going to were occurring. On the other half of the room, there was all these properties being sold. And our folks that were there at the auction are watching these, activity, an immense more activity than on the tax sale side, and go, what the heck are these? And so they started asking, and lo and behold, they are the mortgage, they call them trustee auctions. But there's these mortgage auctions going on. And so initially we were like, okay, well, what are they selling for? We gathered some results. All right, actually some pretty decent deals here. What's going on? Well, come to find out, the process is so, I want to say, convoluted, right? And how these auctions occur, that yes, there are certain portions of those auctions that are saturated, and finding a deal is not easy. But for example, in one county, auction.com, which is one of the larger trustees and hosts auctions, there's those are online. Everybody can participate in them, and finding deals is very difficult. But they were one of maybe 50 trustees that showed up that day. And most people don't know about those other 50. They just assume all of the mortgages being sold are going to be through auction.com. Well, the other 50 trustees can show up anytime between 10 and a.m. and I think 4 p.m. They can show up at literally 3:59, put their feet in the room, read what they need to read. And if nobody's standing there to bid, they walk out, right? And it goes back to so it's stuff like that. It's okay, there's a inefficiency here. How do we take advantage of this, right? And that's we just happen to find it, and we're not the only ones that are attending those auctions. But anybody that's willing to go through that level of effort to be there and participate in those auctions that nobody else knows about, that's where you find great deals.
Yeah, this is why the riches are in the niches, right? Because people, when you niche down far enough, you can find those inefficiencies. But if you're still kind of hovering at the surface as a generalist, you'll never find those inefficiencies. So that's why I love these tales of people who have really niched down deep, because you can then find those market inefficiencies where the real money is to be made. So I love all of that. Bryan, is there anything else you wanted to add on about tax deeds, tax liens, mortgage foreclosures before we call it a day?
Well, I'm one, Brian McBride, spend days talking about all the near, weird niches within each state and how each state works. So anybody that is interested in getting in, I do want to say, definitely consult an attorney to get a really good understanding of how the sales, occur in that state that you're interested in before you just jump in. There's a lot of ways to, despite what you hear out there of, government guaranteed and great return, and those do exist, but there's many, if not more, ways of losing your money in the space. And so, anybody that's listening wants to get, to dive in, then definitely do your research first, please, before you just dive in.
Yeah, no question. I've seen plenty of people lose their shirt on mortgage foreclosures and the like. And like you said, there is sort of a convoluted legal process, and you have to understand that process. You have to know the rules of that game if you're ever going to win that game. So great point. Bryan, in 30 seconds or less, how do you help people, and how can people connect with you if they want to take you up on that help?
Well, anybody that wants to partake in the tax sale space, or even potentially in the mortgage foreclosure space, and just isn't sure how to do that, would love to connect with them. We have lots of different options through tools if they want to do it themselves, through a fund that we operate. So just, if you want to go to taxsaleresources.com, there's a phone number on there. You actually talk to a real person to say, I saw Bryan on Bryan's podcasts, and I'd love to connect with them, and they'll get you in touch with me.
Love it. And we will link to that in the show notes, of course. And guys, if you got a fresh perspective from this quick episode, subscribe to the show, or pay it forward by passing it to a friend, family member, distant cousin, twice removed, whatever. And if you didn't get anything out of this episode, then email us and tell us why at support@sparkrental.com. Let us know what you want to hear more of. And finally, consider joining us in the Co-Investing Club. We get together as a community every month. We vet new investments together, and then we go in on them together with $5,000 or more per person, which is a lot less than the 50 or 100 grand you need if you're going to go in on private equity stuff by yourself. So anyway, if you're unfamiliar with how passive real estate investments work, check out our free course on it, sparkrental.com/free. Quick, snappy episodes to teach you about how syndications work and equity funds, debt funds, all that good stuff. And on that note, stay weird, unconventional investor. We'll catch you next time.